fentanyl, the synthetic opioids, synthetic drugs in general, explosives, chemical warfare agents. I mean, they're all chemicals. Can you project into the future and what would the next illicit substance be? That's pretty challenging. DHS has 5 labs. Each group has their strengths. And that goes into this idea of, with opioid detection, what would the next threat be?
This is Technologically Speaking, the official podcast for the Department of Homeland Security Science and Technology Directorate, or S&T as we call it. Join us as we meet the science and technology experts on the front lines keeping America safe.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Technologically Speaking. I am Brittany Greco, your host, and I'm so honored to be joined today by Dr. Laura Parker from S&T.
Yeah, thanks, Brittany.
You are our Senior Advisor for Sensors and Detection Technologies here at S&T.
Yes. So I come from the explosives detection world originally.
Okay.
Very focused on aviation security at DHS S&T, but there are obviously other areas that explosives detection is really useful for, like what we call soft targets, crowded places. For whatever reason, humans seem very interested in explosives. My husband says it's really great at cocktail parties to mention that I'm an explosives expert, but people are always interested in that. And, it must be so great to blow stuff up. And I guess I wandered off into the explosive side. And we look at giving advice and also looking at emerging technologies and how to apply them to DHS mission space, including all the components at DHS S&T, as well as first responders, state, local, and providing support for Homeland.
That's great. You mentioned, people think that you just blow stuff up all day in your work. And it's actually like, no, we're not trying to blow things up. We want to make sure we can figure out what those explosives materials might be. So if we're talking about someone who might be at airport screening checkpoint, what might they have seen that you've worked on or that S&T has worked on that we're really hoping to help them understand all the science behind the things that they might have interacted with in their everyday lives?
A lot of people have been in an airport and the checkpoint, there's a lot going on, even with how an airport is set up and the jurisdiction of an airport. So the TSA, who's one of our components that we support at S&T, they will buy equipment and install it. The transportation safety officers or transportation security officers, that you give your ID and go through a checkpoint. They all work for TSA, but it turns out the airport itself has an airport authority. Airports are very interesting. When you go through the checkpoint, they do a check that that you're supposed to be flying that day and what flight you're on. And then you have to remove your bags and your shoes if you don't have TSA pre-check. All of us want to be able to keep our shoes on. It's a very complicated detection environment, which is why you are continuing to take off your shoes. We're working on that. We want to be able to make it as smooth as possible to get through there. So you put all your possessions on the conveyor belt and it goes through X-ray imaging equipment. We call that primary screening. And hopefully you don't get an alarm on anything. And if you do get an alarm, it goes to secondary screening. And that tends to be the trace explosive systems. They try to pull out whatever is alarming or they swab around the bag. And what I mean by swabbing is they're collecting particles, a trap or a swab, and it's inserted into an explosive trace detection system. I have worked on that in the past. Hopefully you don't alarm again on the secondary alarm. If you keep alarming, they have to use other methods to resolve that alarm. And some people have to go through the AIT machines, advanced imaging technology, and that's where you have to pose. And that system uses millimeter wave technology. Magnetometers are used regularly, and you can thank the 1970s and the hijackings that occurred for how we have magnetometers, because that back in the day they were keeping weapons off of planes. And so there's a long history which people may or may not know about or remember. But the checkpoint has really evolved. TSA currently has a lot of emphasis on passenger experience and trying to improve travel. A lot more people travel than used to. A lot more families travel, people with strollers, people that are in wheelchairs or maybe more immobile. That's another area that we try to keep up with of how to really help folks get through the airport system.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the swabbing? Can you tell us about some of the technology involved in that process?
Well, the current systems that are deployed are called ion mobility spectrometers. And that has a long history, actually, from the chemical warfare agent detection area. Explosives are chemicals. So that kind of technology is used. And currently, we're looking for trace residues and trace, you can't see it with the naked eye easily. It's actually an analytical chemistry tool that's been around for many years now. We'd really like to make it faster and add more threats of interest that we're looking for. A lot of research goes into that, the false alarms, or that's something we really have to keep in mind, how to not have a lot of alarms.
Definitely.
So you have a trade off with how many threats of interest you're looking for versus having a lot of alarms. They also use what's called colorimetric kits.
Ooh.
For specific types of chemicals of interest. The TSO, or Transportation Security Officers working at their station, might have to check there's a chemical reaction and they show a color change on a strip of paper.
Oh, okay.
And that isn't used as often as these ETD machines for a variety of reasons.
What is an ETD machine?
Explosives trace detection. Yeah, that's our lingo for saying ETDs. If people are chemists out there, they might ask, do we use mass spectrometers? And that's a pretty common laboratory chemistry, analytical chemistry technique that's used. And there's a lot of interest in trying to improve the technology. Currently, we still use the ion mobility spectrometers that are frankly cheaper and somewhat more streamlined to use in an airport environment. But we're always trying to identify what the next technology could be that could really be an improvement. TSA would really like to move on from that and let people carry larger amounts of liquids with them. And so they have bottle liquid scanners also. But that, again, that's a secondary technique that isn't used as often. I notice these detection techniques at the airport because I work in that area. Maybe the average public is just trying to get through. We do think about how to make things more automated in a realistic way. Now, we're not rolling these things out, but there are discussions of not touching any of your items, people walking through more easily. I think that's an important message to send to people. We are always trying to look at what's the next thing that would help. I mean, certainly a border could use some similar techniques. One of my colleagues talks about a robotic arm maybe that would swab instead of humans doing it.
Oh, yeah.
One reason that's important is that it turns out you need a constant pressure or a way to swab. And we've worked with labs like NIST for standardization of that and training purposes, the interplay of technology and training people. It's really a variety of folks at DHS-S&T that would look at standards and standards for training of our TSOs and others, and how much has been done in that area for, proper swabbing technique to pick up as much of the trace residues as you can. And that helps. For one in trace, you have to be able to find the residues. So that's an area of, the interplay of not just chemistry, right, but even materials and or methods.
Yeah.
And we worked on what's called a pressure sensitive wand with NIST, where it would have a light, like a red light, green light. When you swab, would you have the correct pressure? Things like that are something that I never thought about as a researcher in the lab when, when you're a grad student. For lack of a better term, you're kind of like cheap labor. So you do a lot of work or you work a lot. It's not necessarily super efficient, but you're also learning. But then when you're talking about airport environments and operations, you want to give your workers efficient tools.
Yeah, I think you made an important point about saying that explosives are really about chemicals. So I understand that the S&T is also looking at ways to apply some of these detection technologies as we look for synthetic opioids, things like fentanyl. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about how we're taking some of the expertise we have in explosives detection and applying it to illicit drug detection.
So there's definitely crossover. Fentanyl, the synthetic opioids, synthetic drugs in general, explosives, chemical warfare agents. I mean, they're all chemicals. So there's definitely crossover in the technical areas and the technology and the equipment. DHS S&T and Customs and Border Protection, CBP, have labs and experts. They have a really long history, right, of looking for illicit substances. The synthetic drugs have really become more and more prevalent, and fentanyl is, the most well-known of them currently. Just how to deploy equipment in an efficient manner is one of the goals. And fentanyl really poses a lot of issues because of the amounts that are coming through in all kinds of ways. So that's a really complicated system where you don't want to slow down the movement of people and goods, but the fentanyl's caused a lot of issues in the country and the kind of public health side.
No, it's a huge problem. So that trace detection is increasingly important. You hope to make things faster in terms of detection. Are there any specific projects you and your team are working on aimed to achieve that?
I'd mentioned looking at detection as a system, and I'm an expert in, the specific technology that detects chemicals, let's say. And actually, I've worked in X-ray imaging as well. But that being said, there's an interplay, especially with computing power and AI methods, how you could take the chemical data you can get and make more and more inferences about it and merge the layers of data you can get. Years ago, you'd have all this paper. People had to do it in their brains and make correlations. And now we have a lot more data tools to be able to correlate data. That really is the future. And we have multiple experts in the area of AI, data. It's called data analytics. There are a number of commercially available detection systems that can detect opioids or synthetic opioids and, explosives. And there is kind of a systems approach to looking at how do we define the requirements for what you're seeing, how to define requirements for what our end users would want to detect in the field. And I think this goes into the questions about, can you project into the future and what would the next illicit substance be? That's pretty challenging, but also they're engaging a community of industry partners, academics, national labs. DHS has 5 labs, and engaging everybody. Each group has their strengths. And that goes into this idea of, with opioid detection, what would the next threat be? This is a really complicated area where the international drug cartels have a lot of incentives in their world of, it's a lot of money is, that they're bringing in, and the governments, and not just the US government, but around the world, have to balance, what their resources are for the threats. So I can't remember what I said so opioid detection. So we have commercially available technology. We also have to look at how straightforward is it to keep adding chemicals. There's groups looking at what we like to call agnostic detection, that you wouldn't necessarily have to know the exact chemical, but the family of chemicals.
Okay.
And the way the chemical molecules are. You could have a backbone that you look for. But again, fentanyl itself is not illegal because it is
Right.
used for medical purposes and highly regulated. And that also is a contributing factor to, we can't outright ban it. And opioids in general, I mean, again, fentanyl has medicinal use, really important medicinal use, it turns out, but how to work with that and new drugs. So these international drug cartels, it's becoming more and more apparent and known. I mean, they do have skilled technical people working for them. The other thing I think that's important for people to bear in mind, you had asked me about the technologies when I started talking about the environment, right? I didn't even tell you what technologies are used. And one of the reasons I do that is that it really matters what the operational environment is like. But S&T, I'm not an end user, so I need to go out and talk to end users and see what their environment is like.
And when we say end users, we're talking about the officials, like the TSOs, the folks from CBP who are in the field, the people who would actually be using these technologies.
I'm not an expert in CBP's operational environment. I tend to know more about the aviation security. But yes, so I mentioned TSOs and aviation security. There's a group at CBP that are the field officers, and they're at ports of entry. We were talking about the trace detectors, which use ion mobility spectrometry. You have to think about an airport environment is inside, almost always well controlled, believe it or not. You may not feel like it, but it is. If you went to a port of entry, especially really busy one, it's eye-opening, the number of people going through. If you're on the southern border or the northern border, very different temperatures depending on the time of year, and also weather, and just the equipment itself has to be deployed in a manner that it can be used, whether there's electrical outlets available.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody wants everything to be portable, like your iPhone size, but that's not realistic for a lot of chemical detectors, at least currently. That's something to keep in mind. A lot of the best, most sensitive chemical analysis can be done on laboratory equipment. That laboratory equipment, can you really bring it to a field?
Right.
A big mass spectrometer, which I mentioned before, that is the gold standard, typical analytical chemistry lab, shrinking that with the technology inside of it, power, weight, we have to think of all of that when we deploy this equipment.
And that's a lot to consider. There's so many different factors depending on the environment that these are going to be used in. And it's really about making sure that they're usable, useful, accurate, that this is helping the officials on the ground get the information they need to make decisions in the moment, because we can't wait for it to get back from the lab. They need to know right now if this stuff is something that needs to be screened and prevented from coming into the country.
They do actually send things back. CBP does have support labs on site, and they also have what they call reach back lab capability, but that's not ideal. And you would like to have real-time analysis. There's a lot more going on with a lot of constraints, really, right? Emerging technology and how it could potentially be used in a way that's helpful to our end users. But also, you don't want a really long line.
So I want to talk about something that you mentioned earlier about, again, explosives or chemicals. You have a background in chemistry. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about your career journey to get to this point. Was it a relatively straight path, or were there some zigs and zags along the way?
It's more zigzaggy than straight. And maybe just what I thought I was going to do with a chemistry degree versus what I have done is, pretty interesting. I thought I was going to be a biology person because I really liked biology in high school. I went to college and I was going to take chemistry and biology, probably be a biochemist. I actually have a double major with German because I really liked learning another language. And I studied a year in Germany.
Where did you study?
Göttingen in Germany, which is it's not as well known as many big German universities like Tübingen and Heidelberg. But at one point, Göttingen had the most Nobel Prize winners of any university. Of course, it was before World War II. Really well-known quantum physicists had studied there. I didn't know that. I just studied German, and I sat in on one chemistry class. But then I went to grad school for chemistry after that. The German was helpful in chemistry, it turns out, especially my era. There was chemistry journal articles that were written in German, especially from earlier, the 40s, 50s, into the 60s. It did help to know German. And actually, my college, to be a chemistry major, I went to grad school for chemistry, and I went to Penn State. I worked for a new professor. So my graduate advisor in chemistry got his tenure while I was a student of his. My advisor and I got a really great article in Science magazine, which is like one of the premier science journals to publish in. And that, really helped both of us in our careers. And then I did a postdoctoral fellowship to work at Naval Research Lab in Washington, D.C. for 2 years. I went there to work on a semiconductor system, and I ended up working on a pyrotechnic system with the group I worked in, and that set me on the path to work on explosives, which I would not have predicted. And then I got different jobs that were more in that explosives world. I worked at another Navy lab, Naval Surface Warfare Center at Indian Head, which was very kind of traditional Navy. The way we view explosives is safety. You sleep with your munitions on a ship. If there's an accident, there's really nowhere to run easily. So a lot of programs in the Navy are about safety of munitions. And that was where we did blow things up in the lab sometimes. And then through a series of events, ended up at DHS S&T. Again, being able to apply my knowledge to fentanyl crisis and other illicit substances we might be interested in finding.
It seems like just even a decade ago, we weren't hearing about fentanyl as much. So it sounds like there's new stuff coming out, new innovations, both in explosives, both in, illicit materials that we want to prevent from coming into the country. The innovation that's happening by our adversaries, how do we keep up in that race?
There's an interplay with really trying to see what the market has out there, working with groups that watch the intelligence and also local law enforcement, trends that they're seeing, CBP, Customs and Border Protection. They work with the community. We have Drug Enforcement Agency. I'm on the edge of maybe forgetting some groups, but they're in that sort of world, the trade and commerce they're seeing with international drug cartels. And how they move goods. There's a connection to human trafficking always, which is also something we didn't hear as much about 10, 15 years ago. But the current state of commerce, the internet, people moving around, this is how we've come to be where we are, right? And then you can look at technology and how we can use that to help us in our current state. And then looking to the future, that's another area people I work with. They look a lot at AI and AI tools. I mean, I joke at work, you can't go a day without someone mentioning AI in the workplace.
It is definitely a hazard of working at an R&D organization, as we're always hearing about,
well, both what can we do with it and what should we be concerned about, right?
Definitely.
One thing about being the senior advisor for sensors and detection, other than that whole title is a mouthful, is I do have the advantage of having worked in this area at least 20 years. Not everybody can be working on the broad issues, or it gets overwhelming to prioritize. It's very important to identify what we think the problems are and get some verified information that's a problem. Sometimes you think things are a problem and then you delve in and maybe it isn't as big of an issue. We as a group have to rack and stack or rank the problem space to be able to focus. I definitely believe in data-driven solutions. I'm a scientist.
Right.
I had a boss once that said at his level, he said, well, Laura, if these were easy problems, they wouldn't be coming to me. they would be solved by now. Clarify what you think the problem is and whether the data exists. In my world, I could come up with a project or activity to try to get more data in an area. We talk about technology when we started with eye mobility spectrometry. And what do I mean by data? Sometimes data is the problem set, and sometimes data is literally like, what chemicals am I taking a spectrum of? And the interplay of that, it's really a struggle of what's needed right now. You kind of have to balance what resources are available.
Yeah.
And we do talk a lot about futures, and that's become something I've noticed the last couple of years of really trying to project into the future and what challenges we're going to have. And a typical program manager has to do at least a certain amount of strategy. How long does it take this technology to be developed?
In terms of synthetic opioid detection, fentanyl detection, how are youth approaching that problem, balancing that need for short-term solutions while also making sure we're making big strides towards future advances that will help?
You really have to marry the technology with the use case in the field. One of the challenges is we would like to use a detector for everything. I would call it maybe a universal detector. There's always a joke about tricorders for you Star Trek fans out there, which I am one. But it's a lot more complicated to use. A lot of times you have to find the technology that fits with the use case.
Yeah.
So detecting opioids, which is more my area of screening for the chemicals, people also look at the whole system, how drug cartels work and how they move drugs and the movement of money. It's really a whole system versus just my area, which tends to be the chemistry.
So in Star Trek, they had a device called a tricorder that could measure environmental factors and act as a detector for things like oxygen. NASA has developed something similar. Are there any attempts on the part of S&T to develop something similar or, something like that with capabilities to assist with explosive or opioid detection?
So the discussion about tricorders, I think, goes into the area of what I would call a universal detector. And that, again, we were talking about chemicals, and explosives are chemicals, opioids are chemicals, synthetic opioids, and as well as naturally occurring opioids. So I would say there's always an interest in saying we want a detector. The issue is the interplay of how many chemicals you can detect, a false alarm rate.
Yeah.
So getting a wrong answer and what it takes to work on the components and the inner workings of that chemical system. And that's where I was talking about, could you use more data? Can you use more machine learning algorithm techniques? That runs into the AI category. That's a huge challenge.
What types of problems really interested you as you were going through your career, and how have those changed throughout your career?
My original research in graduate school was on a system that was not commercializable. Very fundamental research, the kind of NSF funded area. And I wasn't thinking that much about practical end use cases. I actually worked in an area of chemistry. We call it solid state chemistry. And I worked with metals at high pressures and temperatures like those found within the Earth's core.
Nice.
There's a whole community that looks at this. They're more geophysicists.
Sure.
That's actually part of the way I got the postdoc at Naval Research Lab, because the principal investigator at Naval Research Lab wanted someone who knew how to work at high pressures and temperatures.
Why do you think that was?
Well, explosives is a really broad category. It happens in a higher pressure and temperature regime. Sometimes more just high temperature, like pyrotechnics are on fire and they'll have a sound, but they actually aren't detonating. And there's a lot of distinction between a detonation and just something that's deflagrating, we say, which is on fire. There's a lot of distinction there. And there's a long history of working with explosives for weapons. That world is really fascinating. And again, humans really love explosives for some reason. And pyrotechnics, I mean, they're really pretty. What's interesting is I will say I am not particularly talented at math. And because not a lot of scientists talk about this, I work with a lot of engineers who are very good at math. I have a daughter who doesn't love science and math like I did. I actually did like math a lot, but I found the higher the level of math, it became more and more challenging.
Yeah.
And I have told her, look, I wasn't in advanced math, middle school or high school, and I still got a PhD in chemistry.
It can happen to you?
I think sometimes it may actually make you work harder.
So you mentioned your daughter. Do you have any, guidance or advice for folks who might be looking to get into this field in terms of not just things to study, but maybe questions they can ask themselves along the way?
Definitely. When I talk to groups or I'm asked now, what am I trying to do? And I think 15, 20 years ago, I was thinking more like a diehard scientist, very technical. Now I would say kind of more strategic. I think you do need to focus in an area and become an expert. And also think about, what do you really like to do? I really like to solve puzzles.
Oh, okay.
And I had a really great colleague, and I think that's important to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Do you like solving problems? I mean, some problems are really hard and they're not all that easy to solve.
So who is your favorite Star Trek character and why?
It's Uhura, actually.
Oh, yeah.
Both versions of her, the ability to know that many languages, I think is pretty impressive. But the character, she was at least a female on the bridge with an important job.
Yeah, she's great. Laura, thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you all for listening.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to talk to you today. And I hope people, learn more about what we do at DHS S&T.
Thank you for listening to Technologically Speaking. To learn more about what you've heard in this episode, check out the show notes on our website and follow us on Apple and Google Podcasts and on social media at DHS SciTech. DHS SCITECH. Bye.